53 countries, one deal, and the US dollar is no longer invited. China just pulled off the biggest financial maneuver in modern history, right in the middle of Africa. And most people are still asleep on what this actually means for the rest of the world. Stay with me. There's a shift happening right now that isn't making the front page. It doesn't come with dramatic press conferences or breaking news alerts. It moves quietly, deal by deal, agreement by agreement, one infrastructure project and one currency swap at a time. But make no mistake, what is unfolding across the African continent right now is one of the most consequential economic transformations of the 21st century. For nearly 80 years, the US dollar has been the undisputed king of global finance. You want to buy oil? Dollars. You want to trade between two African countries that have nothing to do with America? Still dollars. The entire world has been running on a financial operating system built in Washington. And for most of that time, there simply was no alternative. Until now. China has launched a sweeping, patient, and deeply strategic campaign to position Africa as the launchpad for the yuan's rise as a global currency. And the evidence isn't theoretical. The deals are signed, the money is moving, the payment systems are live, and the dollar is being quietly shown the exit door across dozens of African nations. So how did we get here? What exactly is China doing? And what does it mean for the rest of us? Let's get into it. In a move that would have been almost unthinkable a decade ago, China finalized a trade agreement with 53 African nations simultaneously, granting all of their exports duty-free access into Chinese markets under a single continent-wide framework. 53 countries, one unified deal. To understand why that's remarkable, consider the comparison. The European Union spent decades negotiating individual trade deals with African nations, typically attached to lengthy conditions around governance and regulatory alignment. America's African Growth and Opportunity Act, the cornerstone of U.S. trade engagement with sub-Saharan Africa, covers a narrower group of nations and has faced repeated uncertainty around its future. China just did something different entirely. But here's what the headlines missed. The trade agreement is only the surface layer. Buried underneath it is a far more ambitious financial objective: to use the African continent as the primary expansion zone for the Chinese yuan, and to systematically chip away at the world's dependence on the US dollar. This isn't Beijing's critics saying this. This is visible in the architecture of the agreements themselves, in the currency swap deals, the payment infrastructure, and the financial partnerships being built across the continent right now. To understand why this strategy is gaining real traction, you need to understand something most financial news doesn't bother explaining. The dollar system isn't just about trade, it's about power. When the US dollar is the world's primary reserve currency, it means that most global commodities, oil, gold, wheat, copper, are priced in dollars. It means that even two countries trading with each other, countries that have nothing to do with the United States, often still use dollars to complete the transaction. It means the U.S. Federal Reserve's decisions about interest rates ripple through every economy on Earth, affecting countries that had absolutely no seat at that table. This arrangement has given America an extraordinary form of invisible leverage over the global economy, what economists call the exorbitant privilege. For most of the post-war era, the world accepted this arrangement. The dollar was stable, the system worked, and there was no credible alternative. Then came February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies responded by freezing approximately $300 billion in Russian sovereign reserves. Money Russia had saved, money held in foreign banks, money denominated in dollars and euros. Just like that. Gone. Inaccessible. From Washington's perspective, it was a powerful and legitimate economic sanction. But from the perspective of governments across Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, it sent a very different message. If your reserves are held in Western-denominated systems, they are not entirely yours. They can be frozen. They can be weaponized. And the decision will be made in Washington, not in your capital. That moment didn't create the desire for financial alternatives, but it poured gasoline on a fire that was already burning, and China walked in with a match and a blueprint. Most people have never heard of SIPS, but, it may be one of the most strategically important financial systems in the world right now. SIPS stands for the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. It's China's alternative to SWIFT, the Western-dominated financial messaging network that underpins most international banking transactions worldwide. When your country makes an international payment, when a government settles a trade contract, when a corporation moves money across borders, those instructions almost certainly travel through SWIFT. It's headquartered in Belgium. Its governance is shaped by American and European institutions. And as Russia discovered in 2022, being cut off from SWIFT is economically catastrophic. CIPS works differently. It allows banks in different countries to transact directly with each other using Chinese Yuan, without routing through dollar-based infrastructure, without exposure to U.S. financial jurisdiction, and without dependence on Western banking architecture. The network is expanding rapidly, and Africa is becoming one of its most important growth zones. This is the infrastructure behind China's currency ambitions, and it's already operational on the ground across the continent. This isn't theory. Let's walk through what's already happened. In Egypt, monetary authorities in Cairo reached formal agreements with Chinese counterparts to settle bilateral trade and investment directly in yuan. No dollar conversion, no exposure to Western banking intermediaries. Egypt, a gateway between Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean, is now settling trade with China in Chinese currency. In South Africa, Standard Bank, one of the continent's largest and most internationally connected financial institutions, became the first African bank to process direct yuan payments with China without routing through the US dollar. That's a historic milestone. And honestly, it barely made the news. In Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation and one of its largest economies, a bilateral currency swap arrangement with China is now valued at 15 billion yuan. Nigerian businesses can trade with China directly in yuan, bypassing the dollar entirely. For a country that has historically struggled with dollar access during oil price downturns, this is a meaningful economic lifeline. Angola has deepened its currency cooperation with Beijing as well. And then there's the BRICS dimension. South Africa is already a member of BRICS, the bloc of major emerging economies that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, a grouping increasingly vocal about reforming global financial governance. Algeria and Nigeria have now been invited to join. If both accept, BRICS would suddenly include 4 of Africa's largest economies: South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, and Nigeria. Together, they represent an enormous share of the continent's GDP, population, and geopolitical influence. A more Africa-centric BRICS would be a dramatically more credible voice for reshaping the global financial order. The yuan isn't just arriving in Africa, it's being embedded into the continent's financial infrastructure, one agreement at a time. To understand why so many African governments are receptive to this, you have to understand what the existing dollar system has actually looked like from the inside. Picture a small business owner in Accra trying to import machinery from China. They have local currency in their account, but to complete the transaction, they must first convert that currency into US dollars, wire those dollars through a correspondent bank, and only then can payment reach the Chinese supplier. Every step costs money. Every step introduces exchange rate risk. Every step depends on access to US dollars, a resource that fluctuates based on forces completely outside their control. Now scale that up to the level of a government treasurer. A significant share of your nation's foreign reserves, your country's financial safety net, sits in dollar-denominated assets held in foreign banks, legally yours, but systemically dependent on the goodwill of governments whose interests don't always align with yours. This is the lived experience of African finance. It's expensive, it's restrictive, and it has constrained African trade, driven up import costs, and forced governments to maintain large dollar reserves rather than directing those resources into domestic investment. When China offers a yuan-based settlement system that reduces conversion costs, removes dollar dependence, and comes packaged with preferential trade access and investment financing, many African governments don't need much convincing. They've been living the problem for decades. China arrived offering a solution. Whether China's solution is as beneficial as advertised is a genuinely complex question. But the receptiveness is real, and it's grounded in legitimate historical experience. You cannot fully tell this story without acknowledging what made the opening possible. When American foreign policy turned inward during the Trump administration, focused on tariff disputes with major industrial powers, proposing reductions in foreign aid, and operating under an America First framework, many African governments received a clear signal: you are not the priority. Diplomatic bandwidth shrank. The narrative of sustained American partnership with Africa lost momentum, and the grand promises of investment and engagement felt, to many African observers, like they were running out of steam. China moved in a completely different direction. Across multiple decades and multiple U.S. administrations, Beijing has maintained and deepened its Africa engagement with remarkable consistency. Infrastructure financing continued, trade expanded, diplomatic relationships were cultivated at every level, from presidential summits to technical ministry partnerships. That consistency built something hard to quantify, but enormously valuable: familiarity and trust. African governments know what dealing with China looks like, and Beijing has been deliberate about how it frames that relationship, emphasizing non-interference, sovereignty, and partnership without political conditions. Whether Beijing fully lives up to that framing is debated, but as a political message directed at governments with long memories of colonial-era conditionality and externally imposed economic adjustments, it carries genuine resonance. Angola shows us what this relationship looks like in its most evolved and genuinely interesting form. For most of its post-independence history, Angola's economy has been defined almost entirely by oil. Petroleum dominates exports, government revenue, and national economic planning. When global oil prices are high, Angola prospers. When they fall, as they did dramatically in 2014 and again during COVID, the consequences cascade through every corner of Angolan society. This is the resource curse, a country rich in natural wealth, yet structurally vulnerable precisely because of it. Angola's leadership has long understood the danger. Diversification has been a stated policy goal for years. But the transition requires investment, expertise, and a willingness to build sectors that don't generate quick returns. Enter China's $350 million agricultural investment. Nearly half of Angola's food supply has historically been imported, a remarkable exposure for a country with vast arable land. That import dependence drains foreign exchange, creates food security risks, and leaves the country vulnerable to global supply chain disruptions. China's investment targets this directly. A $250 million five-year commitment is developing approximately 100,000 acres of agricultural land focused on staple crops: soybeans and maize. Alongside the farmland development, a dedicated seed research and testing facility is being established to improve crop yields, introduce modern farming techniques, and build lasting agricultural capacity. The strategic logic is sound: reduce food imports, create rural employment, build agro-processing industries that add value locally, and construct a more resilient economy, less exposed to oil price cycles. From China's side, the logic is equally coherent. Agricultural investment in Angola secures food commodity supply chains that China increasingly needs. It deepens bilateral economic interdependence, and it advances the broader narrative of China as a structural development partner, not just a resource extractor. The implementation will determine the outcome, but the model itself investment aligned with the host country's own stated development priorities, represents a more sophisticated form of engagement than the simple extraction narrative that has dominated Western commentary for years. Step back far enough from the individual deals and a larger, more consequential pattern comes into view. The global financial order is fracturing. On one side, the existing Western-led architecture, the dollar as the world's reserve currency, SWIFT as the primary banking messaging network, the IMF and World Bank as the dominant multilateral finance institutions. On the other side, an emerging alternative. CIPS as a Yuan-based settlement system, BRICS as a coalition explicitly oriented toward financial reform, new bilateral currency arrangements, and a growing web of trade and investment relationships that operate outside Western-dominated frameworks. Most countries are engaging with both systems simultaneously, which gives them options, but also complexity. The choice isn't always binary, but the direction of travel is clear. The era of unchallenged dollar dominance is ending. Not overnight. The dollar's structural advantages are real and durable. American financial markets remain uniquely deep and trusted. The institutional infrastructure supporting dollar supremacy won't collapse quickly. But the question is no longer whether alternatives will emerge. They already have. The question is how far they will develop, how many countries will participate, and what the long-term consequences will be for global economic governance. Africa, with its 1.4 billion people, its vast natural resources, and its rapidly growing markets, is increasingly central to that answer. So what does all of this actually mean? It means Africa is no longer a footnote in the global economic story. It is the story. The currency agreements being signed in Cairo, the Yuan transactions being processed in Johannesburg, the agricultural land being developed in Angola, the BRICS invitations going out to Lagos and Algiers. These aren't isolated events. They are pieces of a single, carefully constructed picture. China arrived in Africa with a plan. Consistent, patient, strategically coherent, and implemented over decades with remarkable discipline. It offers African nations genuine things they genuinely need: investment, infrastructure, market access, and financial alternatives. And in return, it advances China's own interests: yuan expansion, resource security, growing export markets, and geopolitical influence. Whether this unfolds exactly as Beijing hopes depends on African agency, governance quality, and the choices that competing powers make in the years ahead. But here's what's undeniable. The financial world emerging from this period will not look like the one that existed a generation ago. The dollar will remain powerful, but no longer unchallenged. SWIFT will remain central, but no longer the only road. And Africa, for the first time in centuries, may find itself at the center of global economic gravity rather than at its margins. The real question isn't whether Africa will matter in the 21st century. It absolutely will. The question is, on whose terms? If this opened your eyes to something the mainstream news cycle keeps missing, go ahead and subscribe, because this is exactly what we cover. The financial shifts that move quietly, the deals that rewrite the rules, and the geopolitical strategies most people don't see until it's already done. Drop a comment below. Do you think China's engagement with Africa is a genuine partnership, or is history just repeating itself in a new costume? I want to hear your take. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's actually reshaping the global economy right now. And remember, the people who understand the shift before it happens are the ones who are never caught off guard by it. See you in the next one.